I'm going to show you a nice shot of the full onion harvest here so you can see just exactly what we grew this year. Guten gardening, everybody. In today's video, I'm going to do my best while I'm harvesting the rest of our onion crop to answer 10 common onion growing questions. One of our favorite varieties that we grew this year is our Walla Walla onions. Now that leads us to our first question, which is how do I pick the best onion for me? Now, unless you're planning to grow your onions from seeds, most people purchase their onions as either slips or sets that they purchase at a local greenhouse or a local store. And what I can tell you is the reason those greenhouses typically stock a variety of onion, like this Walla Walla, for example, is that it's a good fit for your growing area. So one way to ensure that the onion that you're picking is the right for your area is to source it locally. Now, we can also talk about taste, but I'm going to focus in more on variety for production. Now, onions fall into 3 different categories: short day onions, day neutral onions, and long day onions. For us, we're in Zone 5, Wisconsin. We typically stick with either day neutral or long day onions because they do better in our cooler growing zones. Now, we can also grow short day onions here in Zone 5. It's just that the likelihood of getting a nice big bulb as a result of growing those is a little less. Now, we are not experts on the topic of short day, day neutral, and long day different varieties. I can tell you there's a ton of resources out there to determine which variety is which. What I can tell you is that the short day variety tend to grow better in zones 7+ here in the US, and that the day neutral and the long day varieties do really well in the cooler growing zones. Because the short day variety we would harvest after about 75 days here in Zone 5, which is going to be a smaller bulb. There's not enough time. Versus these day neutral or long days where we can wait about 110, 115 days before we harvest. So 2 of our varieties here are Walla Walla, and these are just our typical red onions. These are considered to be long day varieties. So they really start to bulb up in late June, and they continue to grow until this point when we're ready to harvest them. Now, in a recent harvest video, I referenced the fact that we didn't use any sets this year, any onion sets to grow our onions, and instead we grew using onion slips. So our second question here is, what's the difference between an onion set and an onion slip? All right, when I talk about onion sets, what I'm talking about are onions that are picked after growing for a little while, picked prematurely, and then saved to plant again the next season. So we see this an awful lot in greenhouses, etc., where you can go in and buy your onions to plant, and they're little tiny onions. You probably know what I'm talking about if you've seen them. The thing is, when we've planted our onion sets in the past, what we've seen happen is a lot of them go directly to seed. And when I say they go to seed, this is what we're looking at here. This is an onion plant that has gone to seed. Now, rather than having that really soft green growth, it sends up this really firm stem at the top. And then if we look down here at the very bottom, you'll see that actually the bulb isn't very big at all because the emphasis on growth has been on this stem and then on the flower production. Now, this is still an edible onion, but what we've found is not only are the bulbs smaller, but in my opinion, they don't taste as good. Now, onion slips, on the other hand, I want you to think of as onion seedlings, because that's really what they are. They were onion plants started from seed, allowed to grow for about 2.5 months or so before they're ready to come outside and go directly into the ground. They're smaller, they look like they're more fragile, but for us, our experience planting those has been the polar opposite of when we've tried to plant with onion sets. We get bigger bulbs, we get better production all around. Now, maybe that's because of the quality of the slips that we've been buying in the past or the ones that we've started in our own greenhouse. But I can tell you, for us, our go-to is to plant onion slips instead of onion sets for better results. One of the things I love about growing onions is you can see the development because they're right there at the surface. So you know how well they're developing while they're growing. It's not really a big surprise like potatoes, but it's kind of nice to see that growth happening. So that leads us to our next question. When is the best time to plant onions? Well, for the answer to this, I'll only speak for us here in Zone 5. We like to plant ours in the early spring. Actually, as soon as the soil is able to be worked, we try to get our plants in the ground. And the reason we do that is because it needs plenty of time for our greens to develop and get a really nice start before the bulbing starts happening, which again starts in late June. Now, again, I'm only speaking for ourselves. My understanding is those warmer zones tend to plant in the fall and let the onions grow over the winter when it's actually a little bit cooler on a regular basis for those short day onions. But for us, we want to get them in the ground early spring so we can harvest them here in later August. Now you can see we've trimmed off the tops of these onion greens, and that's going to lead us to the next question, which is, does trimming back the onion greens produce a bigger onion? Now this is actually a question that I have been researching quite a bit, because I think it's a pretty common thing for people to trim back the onion greens while the plant is in full swing in order to try to force the growth to be on the bulb itself instead of on the greens. But the thing is, if you reduce the ability of photosynthesis by cutting back the amount of greens, it seems a bit counterintuitive that it would actually improve bulb growth. So as I said, I've researched this quite a bit, and the answer that I found that I'm most comfortable with is that it doesn't actually impact the growth of the bulb. Now, if you've experienced something completely different, please let us know in the comments. Now, we did trim a lot of ours back, but after most of the bulbing had taken place, before the greens had gone bad, because we wanted to preserve some of those greens. We actually took them inside, cut them into about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch segments, and dehydrated them so we can use those greens all winter long. But in general, we found our production is not improved by cutting back the greens, and instead we just let them grow until they're ready to be harvested. Now that brings us to our next question, which is, which onion varieties are the healthiest for you to eat? Our primary focus this season were on 2 varieties, our Walla Wallas and our red onions. The Walla Walla because I really like the taste of Walla Walla. They're also a yellow onion, and yellow onions are a very healthy onion. But the answer to the question, which are the healthiest, tend to be your red onions. And the red onions are the healthiest because they have, in addition to the antioxidants and everything else that they have in them that all these onions have, they have anthocyanins. And we've done videos where we've talked about our purple, our black looking, our blue looking vegetables. They have those anthocyanins, and don't take it from me because I'm not an expert on the science behind this, but in reading from the Library of Science, they state that there are some amazing properties that anthocyanins bring to your diet. Plus, I love the taste of red onions. How about you? By the way, the reason you're seeing so many weeds back here is we typically plant our onions outside of our main garden space because most of our common critters like the rabbits, the squirrels, the deer, etc., although we don't have deer around here, and even the voles, they don't bother with onions. So yeah, it's outside of our main garden space. All right, the next question that comes up is, how do you fertilize your onions? Now, I'm not going to suggest that our fertilizer regimen is going to work perfectly for you, but I will say it's a little bit different in some ways in that we do an all-purpose fertilizer at the beginning of the season, so that has some nitrogen in it. And I know onions are pretty heavy feeders, but I will say that throughout this growing season, we didn't add any additional nitrogen at all to our onions. We just added twice throughout the growing season bone meal, and we added langbionite. So that's high on the P and the K. We fed them twice, but we didn't add any additional nitrogen. Now again, that worked very well for us this season. We don't typically have a huge nitrogen issue in our soil anyway, but in general, the reason why we add our bone meal to our root crops is because root crops love bone meal. It helps with the development of all of our root crops. So we add that to every single root crop we plant, especially the onions, and the langbionite is great for the all-around health of the plant. And there you go. Those are the results from just adding those and not adding any additional nitrogen. Now, maybe nitrogen would have been a difference maker and we would have gotten even better results, but I'll stand by those. I think they look pretty great. All right, our next question, how do I know when it's time to harvest these onions? Well, the cool thing about onions is they tell you when they're ready to be harvested. And the way they do that is this beautiful green stem, which is standing up for most of the season, will start to turn this brown color, and then it'll flop over just like that. Once it's done that, we can come out and get these harvested. Now some of these we've waited longer than we should have. You can see this one, it's all shriveled up at this point. That's not ideal, especially for longer term storage. And we'll get to that idea of curing these onions in a little bit. But what happens if you leave these in the ground too long, especially if there's a lot of rain, and there's a whole bunch of rain coming today, they'll start to rot. And you'll notice that they'll get squishy, and that's not something you want. So once they reach this stage, you can go ahead and get them out of the ground. So what happens if my onions decide to bolt? Well, these are onions that actually volunteered this season. So they were small onions that we didn't pick last year, didn't develop much. They came back, and as is often the case with these second-year onions, they will pretty frequently bolt. Now they're going to create one of the most beautiful flowers, in my opinion, in the garden. It's absolutely stunning when it's in full bloom. But what I would recommend, even though these are edible, I would leave these, if they bolt, I would leave these out until they're done flowering, because all of these are onion seed pods. And so especially if it's a variety that you like, you can allow this to sit, and then you can cover it up with some mesh or something just to catch these and allow them to dry out completely. Why would we do that? Well, again, these are seed pods. So here, I'll pull this open, and you can see right there, these are our onion seeds. So next season, we can plant these about 10 weeks, 8 to 10 weeks before we're ready to bring our plants outdoors. We can plant these onion seeds, and we'll have this variety to grow again. Now, one thing to keep in mind again, these should be allowed to dry out completely before you harvest them. So how long will these onions store once you harvest them? Well, the answer is if you allow them to cure, they can store for upwards of 3 months, although we've had some that we've certainly had for longer than 3 months on our shelves. It's just after a certain point, even if you've cut off the top here, they'll start to sprout again. But at least 3 months if cured properly. Now, you don't go to the store and buy 200 onions at once. Well, typically you don't, I don't think. So a big part of growing this much food is making sure that you can keep it for as long as possible. And what you have to do with the onions is to cure them. So how do we cure onions? Well, we've actually done a full video where we talked about how we cure onions. There are plenty of different methods out there, but the key to curing onions is the heat and the amount of time that you can allow them to sit in the heat without exposure to any rain or anything like that. Because the end goal is to get them to dry up enough that the neck will shrink down and basically close up the rest of the onion. Because if we take a look at this red onion, for example, right now, this neck is still wide open. And so if we just put this into our pantry right now, it's susceptible to all number of things, the moisture getting in, to potential damage from insects. But if we allow this to cure for a couple of weeks, to sit out, and we do ours on our porch typically where it's out of the elements, but it's still getting some indirect sunlight and good airflow. If we allow this to cure for a couple of weeks, this will all tighten up, basically sealing off the rest of the onion. And then we can come in about 1 inch above the bulb, maybe 1.5 inches above the bulb, and snip it off. The next time you're in the grocery store and you look at the onions, take a look at the ends of the onions. You'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Those onions have been cured. Now, they've been cured in a professional environment where the humidity is consistent, and it's just something that we don't have the ability to provide. If, though, you are in a warmer climate and you don't get a ton of rain, you could harvest these. Harvest some more. What an easy harvest. But you can harvest these and then lay them out on the ground and let them cure outside. And that's not something we're willing to do because we definitely still get plenty of rain and we don't want any kind of rotting. Well, I am 100% sure that there are plenty more questions that I could answer in this video, but I've got to get these harvested before the rain. I'm not claiming to be an expert on growing onions, but I can tell you we've had some success, and this is what we like to do for our onions here. Now, as this video closes, I'm going to show you a nice shot of the full onion harvest here so you can see just exactly what we grew this year. If you have any other questions about growing onions, please let us know in the comments. We hope you enjoyed today's video, and if you did, don't forget to give us a like, leave us a comment, remember to share and subscribe, and most importantly, remember, When you're with us, you are good to grow.